Welcome to MacStories Unwind, a weekly review of everything MacStories and more. Today's show is brought to you by Concepts. I'm John Voorhees, and with me, of course, is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing just fine and dandy today. It's been a very busy week on the site. We don't have like a long list of stories to talk about today, but we do have some very in-depth stories because you and I were both very busy preparing previews and some other things for the week. And, this is the week that we kicked off our summer preview series of the OSs, where we pull out some topics and write some stories on the site, as well as do some interviews, which are going to start next week. But this week, I think I should kick off by talking a little bit about our developer debrief, which I wrote that and published that at the beginning of the week. And it's kind of amazing to me that this came out this week because it feels like it was a long time ago. But I had the chance to interview 7 developers. It was Vidit Bhargava, Steve Troughton-Smith, Malin Sundberg, Ish Shabazz, Sawyer Blatz, Maj Jabrailov, and John Sundell. And
that's 7 of them. Not 2, not 3, not 4, 7. Okay.
7. Right. I think last year we did 6, and I wanted to, one up
so
last
year. Next year you're going to do 8, right?
Yes, every year we're going to have one more developer. No, I'm not going to do that because actually I got a lot of terrific responses, which I was really pleased with, but I got a lot of very long responses, and 7 people with, 8 or so questions each. It's a lot of material to sift through and organize. But I took we covered a lot of things in this. Some of it's kind of technical, like is Swift UI ready for major projects? And some of it's less technical. It's just what are you excited about, and what do you think is going to be exciting for developers in the fall? And so it was fun to talk to all of them through the written questions, put that all together. And because we had such great answers and weren't able to use all of it on the site, we are actually going to publish the unabridged interviews in MacStories Weekly this week and next. So club members will have the opportunity to read through the full things, the full interviews there, which I think are worthwhile to take a look at, because while the article on the site, I think, does a nice job of kind of organizing things by topic, it's also, I think, useful to see what each individual has to say in the context of their other answers as well.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed that developer debrief and those answers to the interview, and I think it's helpful, especially now that we can attend WWDC in person, to hear the opinions of different developers working on different kinds of products. Right. So the other stories that we published as part of our OS preview summer series, I worked on a iOS and iPadOS 15 preview story because the public beta of both operating systems came out on Wednesday. So just one day before the promised release date, Apple at WWDC, they said they were going to do a public beta in July. But for iOS and iPadOS 15, they launched the public beta on June 30. So day before the promised release date.
That's very un-Apple-like when you think about it, because usually you'd think July 30th, not June 30th when they say July.
Yeah. So I was that was really cool to see, and I worked on a story that I figured, it's impossible for me to cover all of the changes. Also, I feel like some of the things are probably not going to ship, or some of them are going to be different. And I think it's useful for these preview stories to focus on, high-level concepts and high-level features, sort of the main things that people will discover, right, as soon as they install the public beta. So for my stories, I wrote about 3 main areas of interest. Focus, the new Safari, both for iPhone and iPad, and the changes to iPadOS multitasking in version, in 15. So iPadOS 15, what it does with the new multitasking menu, what it does with the new keyboard shortcuts and all of that kind of stuff. I wasn't exactly kind about the new Safari, but, you can get, it's complicated, right? There's a lot of features, there are a lot of changes that I appreciate in the new Safari. We talked about this before, the new start page, web extensions, tab groups, which have grown on me, but there's a lot of things that aren't working for me. both on the iPhone and iPad. And so in the story, I tried my best to explain why those features and those design changes aren't working for me, and what kind of solution I would propose to maybe make that work for more users, including myself. And then I talked about Focus, which is the new sort of Do Not Disturb that is also customizable because you can make your own version of Do Not Disturb now with multiple settings to choose from. And I mentioned Quick Note for iPadOS, which is sort of the sleeper hit of iPadOS, I feel like. And yeah, it was fun to put together tons of screenshots. And obviously, there's a lot more coming this summer, as well as in my proper iOS and iPadOS 15 review at some point, I would guess in September.
Right. I expect that we'll see probably macOS in a similar time frame this year. I mean, we've had the last few years, it's been really erratic, the span between when iOS and iPadOS comes out and macOS shows up. But one of the things that's a theme this year that I wrote about in my preview story about Monterey is that things are more aligned now than they ever have been. And I think we're really entering this new era of better aligned OSs across the board. And the evidence to me of that is how many of the things that you just talked about are also the big features of Monterey this year. And the public beta is now out. I've been using Monterey since it came out at WWDC, so about 3 weeks now. And I covered, like you, I covered Safari, and I have a similar takeaway from it. It's the issues, I think the design issues, it's interesting because there are all design issues across the board with the new Safari, but they're a little different on each platform. And the thing about it on the Mac is that there's just simply too much crammed into this new unified tab bar, toolbar thing at the top of the page. But like you, I also have a lot of things that I like about it. And I'm a huge proponent of the tab groups right now. I'm really here to tell you the good news about them, Federico, because I've found that this has been a really good way to deal with interruptions in the middle of my day where I can, if I'm working on something and I have a handful of tabs open, I can quickly save them, move on to something else. And then when I have time to go back, there they are, kind of in this freeze-dried state. It's a little bit, I think of it a little bit like Time Machine for tabs, where you've got this state of tabs preserved for a later date, whether it's because you're doing a big research project and you don't have time to complete it in one sitting, or whether you get interrupted by another task and have to go back to something later. So that's probably my favorite feature so far of Safari. But I also dove in, of course, about shortcuts for Mac, which is probably, at least for a lot of our readers, I think is the major news of Monterey this year, the bringing of shortcuts over to the Mac, and the fact that it really works really well right out of the box. A lot of my shortcuts, the very first time I opened the app, already worked. There is now scripting support with things like AppleScript and shell scripting baked right into shortcuts for Mac, and a bunch of different ways you can trigger them as well. So there's a lot to explore there, even before developers come out with native integrations into their own Mac apps. So definitely, if you're downloading the beta, that's a place to spend some time and check it out. And then I also covered Focus, because that is another feature that's available across all platforms. Quick Note, and AirPlay for Mac and Live Text. AirPlay for Mac is one of those things that I think people, once they realize it's there, will find that it's kind of handy, because if you're out doing errands in your car and you're listening to music on your iPhone or a podcast or something, and you come back in, Apple's already had a solution to hand that music or podcast off to a HomePod, for instance. But there's never been a good way to do that with a Mac. So if you're sitting down to work and you want to continue that playlist you've been listening to with AirPlay for Mac, you can do that now. It's not the handoff functionality that I kind of expected Apple would do, but AirPlay for Mac works pretty well too that way. So I think it's an interesting feature that a lot of people will find immediately useful to them. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I did a similar thing. I kind of concentrated on the things that over the past 3 weeks were the ones that actually stood out to me and were things that I immediately found useful and have been using a lot. There are other things that aren't in there yet. Universal Control, for instance, is not in the beta yet, so I haven't had a chance to test that.
Are you going to use that?
I don't think so.
Like besides the test. Okay.
Maybe. I'm very interested to try it, Federico, because
it makes for a perfect demo, right?
It does.
But practically speaking, do you feel like you find yourself, having an iPad next to a Mac and be like, oh, I wish I could drag the cursor there?
Maybe not today, but maybe a year ago. The thing is, see, if this had been a thing before shortcuts came to the Mac, maybe. Because that's the thing, is that a lot of times when I'm putting together one of our newsletters or something, we use a lot of shortcuts. And so I would use shortcuts on my iPad and then kind of find a way to get the information over to my Mac as I was putting together the newsletter. And I could see in that context something like this working really well, where I make a list of, URLs, for instance, copy them and drag them from the iPad over to the Mac. But now that I have shortcuts on the Mac, I'm not so sure it's going to be something that I use regularly, but it's there if you want it. I mean, I could see people who prefer to, for instance, maybe edit photos or draw illustrations for something they're working on their Mac, on their iPad, just being able to then drag that, use their pointing device and pull that from the iPad straight over to the Mac, maybe. But I think in practice, for the kind of work that you and I do, I'm not expecting that it's going to be a big thing. I do like to have my iPad next to my Mac, but that's usually more for things like using it as kind of a secondary screen for keeping track of things like messages from, the MacStories team and things like that. And even though I could do that as part of Sidecar or something, I really don't, because I've got the same apps available on iPadOS anyway. So I just use them next to each other, but separate. And it works well for that kind of messaging type thing.
Right. All right, we'll see. I guess when Universal Control becomes available, maybe in beta 3. We'll see.
Right.
John, what else was new on the website this week?
All right. So we had some stories that I did earlier in the week. We got a nice update from Pixelmator Pro, which is the Mac image editing app from the Pixelmator team. And it adds what was teased earlier in the year, a new feature called ML Crop, which uses machine learning to suggest crops of your photos. Now, none of this is destructive or anything. You can reject the suggestion, but I found in my kind of limited testing of it so far that it works pretty well. It's comparing your image and the subject of your image to a machine learning database of other images that it's been fed, and coming up with an interesting dramatic crop of, a portrait or a landscape or whatever it happens to be. And that's a pretty cool feature. There's also a new feature called Quick Fill Color. Now, Quick Fill, the entire painting and color section of Pixelmator Pro has been reworked to some degree or another. Quick Fill is one of the major new parts of that, which allows you to use its new color well and simply drag colors from the color well right into a section of an illustration and change the color. It's just a really handy way to do that. So that's kind of cool. There's new things in the text tool for adding text. These are things that I don't really use in Pixelmator Pro because I mostly use it for editing screenshots and that sort of thing. But if you're using it for illustration work or more sophisticated photo editing, these are really nice things to add. We also got this week some new watch bands from Apple, which I suspect they've been sitting on a while, because these are this is an international collection that is very much timed to coincide with the upcoming Olympic Games in Japan. But obviously, I don't think Apple probably has the rights to use the name the Olympics, because they kind of danced around that a little bit in the press release. But we've got 22 countries represented, right, with 22 sets of colors for these watch bands. They're the sports loop bands, and then watch faces that go along with them. And I know Italy was one of them, and I put that right in our hero image because I think I'm contractually obligated to do that. I thought the Italian one looks nice. I really like New Zealand. Yes. New Zealand's just kind of a classy-looking black and gray combination that works really well, but between the watch face and the band. But those are pretty cool.
Yeah, I thought those are interesting and fun idea, right? Even though it cannot be called the Olympics for reasons.
Right.
I also linked a story by Sami Fathi on Mac Rumors, about a change in iOS and iPadOS 15 Beta 2. Apparently, there's a new API for developers to request usage of a higher amount of RAM. So this is interesting because so far, especially on iPad Pro, even if you have an M1 iPad Pro with 16 gigs of RAM, it appears that apps are limited to using 5 gigabytes of RAM, right?
Okay. Yeah.
For, again, reasons we don't know. But it appears that, and when the M1 iPad Pro came out, we all wondered, including myself in my review, we all wondered, well, how and like when are developers finally going to be able to take advantage to tap into that RAM and unlock more powerful functionality in their apps? And it seems like those days are coming to an end in 15, provided, and there's a big asterisk here, this is an entitlement that developers have to request to Apple, and Apple will need to grant that entitlement to developers. And apparently, in the beta, the documentation right now says this entitlement informs the system that an app may perform better by exceeding the default app memory limit. So obviously, the default app memory limit isn't explicitly mentioned in developer documentation, but we know based on previous findings, such as from the developers of Procreate or my own tests running shortcuts, for example, we know that the limit on iPad Pro at least is around 5 or 6 gigabytes of RAM. So within that threshold. Now, as I wrote on MacStories, like I never found myself in that sort of scenario where I was working on the iPad Pro and I thought, oh, you know what? I wish I had more RAM so that I could complete this task on my iPad. Like that never happened. But also, I'm not a graphics editor. I'm not a video editor. I'm not a professional photographer, right? So those kinds of apps where it's likely that you may take advantage of a higher memory limit, I don't use those. But I think it's important to allow developers of those kinds of apps to use that kind of power that the M1 iPad Pro has. And I'm curious to see how this will go, practically speaking, like what kind of developers will request this entitlement and how frequently will Apple grant this entitlement to third-party developers. I'm pretty sure you see this and you think, okay, Adobe, LumaFusion, Procreate, all those kinds of apps. But I want to see will indie developers request access to this? Are there some developers out there who are looking at this information right now and saying, well, you know what, now maybe I can actually port my desktop program to the iPad Pro? I don't know. I want to see what happens here.
Well, it's interesting this exists, and I guess the program works a little bit like how it works if you want to have a CarPlay app, which also requires a special entitlement that you have to ask for specifically. And you and I may not run into these kind of things, but I do suspect that some of these makers of these pro-level photography and video apps are probably holding back features that they could otherwise do, but they can't because they don't have the RAM to do them, and that in testing they have discovered that things lock up or don't work if people feed an app too much data at one time. So I'm glad that this exists. It'll be just interesting to see in practice whether this is a common thing for certain categories of apps or whether there's just some special cases for the real big players like Adobe, for instance. All right, Federico, let's talk a little bit about the club because it was a big week on the club. We had 2 newsletters come out this week. One was the monthly log. I wrote about both my use of tab groups, which I already described in my preview, which is one of my favorite new Safari features. And I also talked about having a flexible work setup when you have a home office and are working from home, because I found myself last weekend dealing with torrential rain, which basically destroyed my home office and forced me to kind of reset up with my writing environment on the first floor of our house and my podcasting setup, where I'm recording this at this very moment in my bedroom, which I'm not sure whether I'm perfectly fine with this, especially the podcasting setup, but for now it works. So I don't know if I'll be going back into what was my basement office because there's a lot of cleanup and work that has to be done down there before I would go back, and I'm not sure I want to. So we'll see. That was an interesting thing to write I'm kind of upset about the whole situation. On the other hand, the silver lining is that it kind of demonstrated to me that I really don't need a specific place as much as I need just a flexible setup, which turns out I've got, which is a good thing.
Nice. Yeah. I'm really sorry to hear about your studio, but maybe it's for the best. Who knows?
It may be at the end of the day.
Maybe at the end, silver linings and all that.
Exactly.
In MacStories Weekly, John, I wrote about 5 iOS 15 features you probably haven't heard about. So I took, from my long list of smaller iOS 15 features that I'm supposed to write about eventually, I took 5 of them and I wrote about them. So that includes, I don't want to spoil it, but that includes
don't spoil it all.
PDF stuff and something new you can do with Siri and how that works. It's fun. It's a fun roundup. And so you can find that in MacStories Weekly. And I know, John, you wrote about this interesting browser app for iOS and iPadOS, which is also a research utility.
It is, and this is one that actually you linked to in MacStories Weekly maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's called Command, and it's a browser. And what it allows you to do is to browse the web, do research, but at the same time, pull quotes and highlights out of the pages that you visit into what it calls journals. And the app has a bunch of integrations built into it. It works with Readwise, for instance. It also works with Roam Research and to a degree Obsidian, but it's an interesting way to pull together research materials in a separate volume, this journal that it creates, and then you can get the information back out by exporting it. So I've been playing around with that a little bit as I do some of my early research for the review in the fall, and it's been a lot of fun. So there's that, and of course we also had the unabridged versions of some of the interviews that I did earlier in the week for that developer debrief. So I'm going to do about half of them this week, and then the other half will come next week. So those will both be in MacStories Weekly as well.
Nice.
Then, Federico, way back on Monday, we published App Stories, and we talked all about shortcuts. And that obviously is a topic that you and I know and love. And we went through really every single thing that is changing on shortcuts. So if you're interested, before you download those public beta previews, to see what's new, both in shortcuts on the iPhone, iPad, and the Mac, that's a great way to do it because we run through the changes in the editor as well as the individual action changes on each of the platforms, which there are quite a few.
Yeah, there's a few changes to actions on all platforms, really. I mean, obviously on the Mac you have actions for that are important from Automator, right? You have all kinds of things, sort of complementing and replacing what Automator could do with PDF documents and Windows and shell scripts and AppleScript and Finder. But also some of those are available on iOS. So we talked about file management. We talked about being able to extract text from images and PDF documents. So I found a few things you can do, with OCR-like workflows, for example. It's a fun episode. It's a good overview of all the things that are changing in shortcuts this summer. So yeah, go check it out. And I mean, obviously, we are going to document all of this extensively on the club and on MacStories when shortcuts for iOS 15, iPadOS 15, and macOS Monterey launches in the fall.
Yeah, it's gonna be a lot of fun. All right, Federico, let me tell you about our sponsor for this week. And this week's sponsor is also the sponsor for our entire Summer OS preview series, and that's Concepts. Sketch, note, and explore endless ideas with Concepts Infinite Canvas for iPad. You can draw with designer Copic colors using liquid pens and brushes and organize images, text, and sketches into visual mood boards. It's used by creative professionals for visual thinking, note-taking, team communication, storyboarding, product design, and architectural planning. Concepts lets you sketch and share your ideas in the moment. Everything you draw in Concepts is a flexible, editable vector. You can nudge, edit, and reorganize your ideas with natural finger gestures. You can drag and drop images and objects onto the canvas for fast ideation and reference, and use layers and grid layouts to organize your work too. You can even do things like markup PDFs, which is something that I've done in the past as well. You can export and share high-resolution vector files of all types for flexible work between teams and apps. Whiteboard virtually with your team using apps like Zoom and then instantly sharing the discussion. The app comes free as a basic sketching tool, and the ability to unlock 200 plus libraries of brushes, objects, and services via a subscription or one-time purchase. To learn more, visit Concept's website at concepts.app. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of the show. All right, Federico, we're going to do some Unwind picks. And I know because you were traveling all over, it seemed like you're traveling all over Italy, but it was actually in a fairly narrow central Italy
It's a narrow
triangle.
region, but it's multiple places within the same region. But yes, I've been traveling a lot and I've been driving a lot, which means I haven't played any video games and I really want to. And I haven't watched any TV shows and I really want to, or I haven't listened to music at all. So it's been a busy past few days. Yeah.
All right. Well, before the Great Flood,
save me, John.
I will because
thank you.
I do have one true pick, because before the Great Flood hit my house on Friday night, I watched a really good movie.
Is that what we're calling it, the Great Flood?
We're calling it the Great Flood. It's okay. There was a whole Noah's Ark thing going on here. It felt like 40 days and 40 nights.
Well, I have to assume that you saved one of each adapters that you have.
I did. One of each dongle. we got the
greater
USB-C.
good of the species.
yes. We have one of each, USB-A, USB-C, and all the different connectors on the other end. So the movie that I watched Friday night before everything went crazy was The Dry. And The Dry is an Australian film about a guy who's a police officer in the federal police force in Australia who comes home for the funeral of a childhood high school friend that they think killed himself. And I don't want to give away too much about this, but it's basically a murder mystery. And it's one of those murder mysteries where the motives and the story stretches way back from the current time frame, which is this guy's maybe in his late 30s or 40 years old, back to when he was in high school and the people he knew in this very small town in this very dry region of Australia. And so it's got that kind of creepy small town vibe to it, where there's a lot of history, a lot of long memories of residents, and some secrets in the past that have reflected in what happens in present day with these deaths. So it's a really good movie. I think on like Rotten Tomatoes, it got something like 90 or 92% positive ratings. It's one of the better films that I've seen in a while. Not one that I really knew much about, but I guess it was one that did really well at some film festivals last year. So if you're looking for something to watch, that one I think is definitely worth checking out.
All right. That's a good pick. Thank you, John.
Sure. All right, Federico. It's been quite a week. I want to thank our sponsor again for this show, and that is Concepts, who's also sponsoring the entire summer series. You can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram, where he's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next Friday, Federico.
Ciao, John.